What are the main struggles of working parents and what can we do about them? My guest today is Dr. Ann Welsh. She is a clinical psychologist specializing in the transition to motherhood and the transition from parent to working parent. We talk about parents missing their old selves, feeling unhappy, or feeling overwhelmed, but more importantly, what can we do about having these feelings? I'm Anthony Franzese. This is the Successful Working Parents podcast where we learn from busy working parents how they're able to balance it all and still thrive. Thank you for listening. On to the show. Welcome back to the Successful Working Parents podcast, the podcast where we talk to successful working parents. My guest today, she is a clinical psychologist, consultant, and coach specializing in the transition to motherhood and working parenthood, mother of four. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ann Welsh. Dr. Ann, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to talk to you today. So, usually we kick off with just a quick background on your career, if you would share that.
Yeah, sure. So I started out actually in research when I was studying clinical psychology, and I was not yet a parent, but one of my research lines was looking at the transition to parenthood. I was really interested in like how people navigated going from one thing to another. I also was doing research at the time in career development. Um, I had no intention of combining them. It was just kind of these two pieces that I was looking at. And my career has taken a lot of pivots. I ended up moving into clinical practice and doing university mental health at Harvard, which had been like a dream job, right? I loved college students and I was at Harvard. That was great. And unfortunately, as I started to grow my family, it just wasn't working anymore to be doing that job. And so I ended up leaving and starting my own practice. That therapy practice has a focus on maternal mental health. And then after a few years of doing that, I realized I was hearing a lot of the same things from my parents, in particular around how hard it was to make this working parenthood thing work. So that's when I started adding coaching and consulting, thinking I could kind of better support working parents in a more multifaceted way and approach the problem from a lot of different directions. So now I do a mixture of all three, but really the common thread is supporting working parents in both their kind of family growth and their growth at work.
Awesome. And you have four kids, right?
I do. Yeah. My youngest is 8 and my oldest is 14.
Wow. Well, I'm sure you have your hands full and we're going to get into all that. But what I wanted to talk to you today about was the focus in your practice, which is around this transition into working parenthood, which is a lot about what this podcast is about. So, what are some of the main struggles that you hear from working parents?
Yeah. I would say that there's kind of a couple themes that tend to show up. And one is feeling like they miss their old selves, right? Especially when they're transitioning to like that first kid of like, I used to be X and now I'm not. Um, and sometimes it's a little bit of, I feel like maybe I can access that old self a bit at work, but sometimes it's like I don't even know who I am anymore. Um, Another big one is just totally feeling overwhelmed by everything that you have to get done, or feeling like you're failing at everything. Right? Like I'm not being a good parent. I'm not being a good employee. I'm not being a good leader. Whatever. Um, Another big theme is just feeling really lonely. Lonely in that struggle, but just lonely in general, and not being able to connect with other adults. And then the last theme is that sometimes people just are not happy. And they don't necessarily know what the problem is. And they're saying, I wanted this kid, I wanted this life, and now I'm really miserable and I'm not quite sure why. And I feel horrible saying that. And I assure you, like, if you're struggling with any of those things, it's really, really normal.
So, let's talk about this a little more. So, missing their old selves. So, I just had my first child about 8 months ago, 8.5 months ago. So I could definitely relate to just this new feeling of how different life is
Yeah.
after becoming a parent. And so, what do you tell people when they feel this way?
Well, the first thing I say is that again, it's super normal, right? In some ways, becoming a parent is one of the largest kind of moment transitions you will ever go through. Um, and no matter how prepared you are, it's gonna throw your world upside down for a little while. I mean, I like to tell people I had done research on this, right? I had spent years researching the transition to parenthood, and I actually my dissertation was on the transition to parenthood. I defended it about 8 weeks pregnant. I had to like go, get a trash can afterwards because I had so much bad morning sickness. And I still was taken by surprise by how big of a change it was. Because essentially you're taking a kind of whole identity and trying to smush in a whole new part. And the only way to have that happen is to have everything change or shrink. And I tell people if you give it time, it will integrate better, but transitions take time, right? They don't happen overnight. And so a lot of it is a lot of the work around that is then kind of digging into what was I, what parts do I miss, is there room to include those again, what parts am I maybe going to intentionally get rid of, what don't I want to pick back up and reintegrate, and what are these new parts that maybe I could grow into and appreciate.
Yeah. I personally really enjoy being a father and a parent. It's been great so far. I've talked a lot on this podcast about how there is actually, I think, it has a bad rep out there. Like, I think people were really telling me like how hard it was going to be. And of course it is hard, but I feel like it almost has like a bad brand to be a parent sometimes, or how difficult it is. And I've been trying to sort of champion the opposite of that. But at the same time, there are some real struggles. That's basically what your work is focused on. So, how do you reconcile that? Like, people come into your office and they're genuinely unhappy with their new life. And so, how do you help people to see that, like, beyond that being okay, like, do we get them happier? Do we get them to realize that their life is better? Or do some people just dislike the way their life is now?
I don't. I mean, I think that's an excellent point, and it's funny because as I mentioned, my oldest is 14, and when I had him, the narrative around parenting was very different, right? There was no one saying, "Hey, this is hard," and I found it incredibly challenging, and I felt like the worst parent in the world because my assumption was it was hard because I was somehow screwing it up, right? And that everybody else had this figured out. And I was that parent then that told, I was the first in my group of friends to have a kid. So I had no one else to kind of give me any advice. And so I, would sit them down and I would say, there's going to be a moment when you have this kid and you're going to either think, what the heck did I do? I'm the worst parent ever. Everyone's going to cry. And I told them all, like, you're going to feel that way and it's okay. You're going to get through it and you're going to be glad you had a kid and there's going to be wonderful moments too, but to just kind of normalize that it is challenging. So I think there is a lot of value in normalizing the hard, right? And helping people recognize this is hard because it is a hard thing to do, not because you're failing. So that's the first message, right? Because I think when people show up and they're unhappy, part of it is often the sense of, I haven't gotten like the hack down yet, right? Like somehow this is a me problem. Then it's a little bit at kind of getting more intentional and saying, like, what is behind that unhappiness? So is there, again, a part of yourself that you've kind of put down and lost that we can bring back in? Or is there a lot of resentment showing up because it's changed your relationship with your partner and you're not communicating as well? Or, especially in my therapy practice more than my coaching practice, sometimes having a kid really stirs up stuff about ourselves that we put to rest or that we thought we put to rest, right? You may think you kind of dealt with all this stuff from your childhood and your own parenting and you're feeling like you're doing okay, and then you have a kid and it just flares right back up again. So sometimes there is a lot of work around that to get through to a happier place as a parent.
Would you advise people to think long and hard about becoming a parent before they do, based on what you've seen? Like, do you actually feel like it is so tough on some people that maybe some people should reconsider?
I don't know that I would say that. And I would say, I have certainly encountered some people in my practice where they've probably overthought it, right? Where it becomes almost like debilitating analysis paralysis and trying to decide whether to have a kid. I would say more prepare to get support, right? That's the big thing. You are going to need help. You cannot do it alone. And that support might look different for different people. That might mean mental health support. That might mean tangible support in some way, but to recognize that this is not something you can just kind of white knuckle your way through. You're going to have to reach out. You're going to have to develop some sort of flexibility and kind of plan for it to not go as planned.
Sure. Okay, so let's say we have our kid and we're dealing with the usual ups and downs, but we're enjoying it, and now it's been 2 or 3 months and it's time to go back to work. and now we have to both be parent and employee again. This is something else I have recent experience with, and certainly a challenge for a lot of people. So, what are some of the main challenges that you see specifically with people returning to work, and what are some of the main tools that have helped them?
Yeah. So I love this question because one of the things that I do is parental leave coaching. So I literally actually will come and for this exact purpose typically I'll start with people before they have the kid, right? But do some coaching around how are we going to plan for your leave? How are we going to plan for that transition and in a work perspective? Then some support while they're on leave and then some coaching when they return. And the data on parental leave coaching is great in terms of retention and employee satisfaction. So it's this wonderful tool. But the big takeaways I would say is plan ahead. Before you even go on leave, be thinking about how you're going to hand your work off, who you're going to hand it off to, and plan ahead for that return. How are you going to want to pick it back up? And I say plan for work, but also at home. So as much as you can thinking ahead, because you have this transition to parenthood, you add a kid, then you have this transition to working parent, which is a whole separate transition layered on top. And
Totally.
two things at once is real hard. Um, Overall, I also say give yourself a lot of grace and again, ask for more help than you think you're going to need. I kind of tell people like, you're going to have a baby all over again. So remember how you stocked the freezer with meals and your friends helped you and got you gift cards or, Uber Eats or whatever. Do that a second time, 3 months or 6 months later or whatever, because you are going to want some of that stuff. That like automatic ability to feed yourself or do whatever it is you need to do. Um, and the other piece I say is just communicate a lot, especially with your partner around this transition, because you're gonna struggle in moments, and it's gonna be okay too.
Yeah. What about on the company side? Are there things that employers could or should be doing more of to support this transition?
Totally. I think that companies can do a lot of things to support working parents. And on a basic level, step one is just have good parental leave policies, not just maternity leave, but parental leave, right? There's a lot of data out there that shows when dads take leave, they end up more involved in the kid's life, the rest of that kid's life. Um, Leave is good for, I know you had Orly Cortell on here, right? Leave is good for mental health, for physical health. So like a very basic line, you've got to have a good parental leave policy. But beyond that, I think I try to start companies down the road of thinking about creating a culture of care, a culture where there is respect and trust. Trust that workers and working parents are going to show up and do their best, and they're going to put in the effort, and they're going to want to do well. And if they have to leave because a kid is sick or because daycare is closed or whatever, that doesn't change. And so, kind of in tangent with that, we want companies to offer flexibility of what hours are worked, of where the work is done, of how the work is done. So that could be asynchronous work environments with a lot of tools and technology to support it, but it could also be, saying, yeah, we have our in the office days, but as long as you're in the office, sometime between 10 and 3, we don't care where it is other than that. And as long as you're getting your work done, that's the big priority, other than maybe, these X meetings that have to be on the schedule. So that's another big one. And then the other thing I just encourage companies to do, and I work around them a lot with, is understanding that working parents actually bring a lot of value to the table. And so when that's just part of the thought process, then there is more interest in supporting them and adopting all of these policies that help.
What do you mean when you say working parents bring a lot to the table?
So I think that there is this stereotype that you can't be a good parent and a good employee, or that parenthood and working person life are two separate silos that shouldn't intermix. And yet, when you have a baby, or when your partner has a baby, this is not just for birthing parents, your brain actually changes, and it is the most primed for learning it's going to be, other than childhood. It's getting ready to learn all these new skills, and you're in it, right? You're probably feeling like, I'm drinking from the higher fire hose, I'm learning stuff all the time with this kid. And that primed for learning brain is such an asset to work. So there's some specific skills I think that you gain as a parent that are really important. And I call them the 5 Ps of parental leadership lessons. So one is people skills. That's the stuff we always talk about, right? Emotional intelligence and empathy and communication, right? Those soft skills that contribute to really good leadership. Those you learn in spades as a parent. You have to be incredibly empathic. You have to learn to communicate well with your partner. Otherwise, you're not going to survive. The next P is processing. So things like being decisive, prioritizing, being adaptable, right? You have to take in a lot of information very quickly in parenthood and then act on it. And that's a great skill as a leader, both an emerging leader or a senior leader, to add to your repertoire. The next one is productivity. So, there's that old adage, if you want something done, give it to a working parent, right? You have to be, I'm sure you know, incredibly productive. You've got to use those 5 minutes that you've got to get some work in, or use nap time on the weekend to get something done around the house, because there's just a lot to be done. And so working parents really learn how to be very productive with their time. The next one is perspective planning, or perspective taking and planning. As parents, we're always multitasking, we're prioritizing, and we're anticipating needs, right? The story I like to tell is that, imagine a parent going to the beach with your kid, and you need to plan what time of day you're going, because you need to plan around nap time. What snacks do you need? What sunscreen do you need? What toys do you need? What time do you have to leave so that you can actually get home at a reasonable hour? How are you going to get all this to the beach while maybe your toddler's like running ahead into the water in an unsafe fashion, right? There's so much anticipating and thinking ahead. That's what project management is, right? And so your ability to do that as a parent translates into your ability to do that at work. And then the last one that I've kind of been thinking about more recently is just that this piece of playfulness. I think sometimes when we have kids, it can really help us hone into our playful sides.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of good data out there on playfulness being a key thing for resiliency, for creative problem solving. And again, those are really wonderful tools to have at work as well. So there's like all of these ways that parents are growing and changing that they can bring to work, especially if workplaces recognize that value and maybe even help parents kind of hone it and bring it in.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. Me and my wife have been singing a lot of nursery rhymes lately, and I feel like it's adding like a little levity to the situation, and definitely makes it's hard to like get really annoyed about something when we're just singing like the Muffin Man like 5 minutes ago.
Exactly, exactly.
People have different thoughts on the concept of work life balance, and I think it's a really interesting topic and word phrase when it comes to being a working parent. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the idea of balance and work life balance. Do you even call it that?
I do, but I think first of all we get really wrapped up in semantics, and I don't think that the language is actually the most important thing. Whether you call it balance or integration, really we're all talking about the same thing. How do you do these two things at once? How do you do working personhood and parenthood, and find a way to fit them both? And so I kind of talk about it as recognizing that you've got a lifetime with a lot of seasons, and it's always changing. And those seasons could be short or long, but what that balance or that integration is going to look like will vary. Maybe even week to week, it could vary year to year. I use the example of like standing on a balance beam. If you're walking on a balance beam, maybe not if you're Simone Biles, but if you're any of the rest of us humans, right, you're tipping back and forth a little bit, and then you kind of catch yourself and you lean back the other way. And that's more what it's going to feel like over time, right? Is not like some magical state of I've got balance figured out where it's this really consistent version, but maybe I have a project that's pulling my attention at work and I'm a little bit away from the family and a little bit more invested in my work. And then maybe something pulls me back into family, and yeah, I'm not as present at work, but I'm more present at home. And there's just this kind of back and forth over most of our lives. And if we kind of accept that, right, and think of it as this process that we're just constantly undergoing rather than some sort of magical nirvana that we've failed to reach, I think it gives us a lot more grace for ourselves, a lot more self compassion. And it allows us to be okay with wherever in that tipping balance beam feeling we are.
I want to go back to the topic of overwhelm. I feel
Yeah.
like this is a big one. Certainly something that I can relate to. And even before you become a working parent, just parenthood itself, right? Very overwhelming. So when someone comes to you and they're saying, I'm a new mom or new dad, and I'm feeling so overwhelmed, what do you say to them?
So, a couple of things. First, I think we'll start working around what balls can you kind of intentionally put down, right? That feeling of overwhelm often comes from that, we use the analogy like you're juggling a lot of balls, right? And that's true of everyone. We're all juggling a lot of balls. Some of those balls are glass. We're not going to just put those down. And we do have to be worried about dropping them because if we drop them,
Yeah.
they will break.
Yeah.
I would put our
Literally and figuratively and simultaneously.
exactly, right? And I would put our kids' health and safety in that, right? That's a
Sure.
that's a glass ball,
Oh
right?
yeah.
So I encourage people to recognize that the rest of them are probably rubber. Now, you're gonna if you drop it or if you put it down, it might roll away. You might like look like a hot mess running down the street to get it. It's gonna get dirty. It's not going to break. And so, what can we intentionally put down so that you don't feel like you're juggling all the balls? That may mean I just completely ignore it. That may mean I hand it off to someone else to take care of. For example, if I don't fold the laundry for 3 years straight and we live off of laundry baskets, is that how I would like to do things? No. Is the world going to end? No, right? It's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
really a big deal. And so that could be one you put down. If we eat takeout for a month, does that mean that, everyone's going to die of, diabetes? No, right? Like it's a month. So this idea of what can we put down for a little while so that we cannot feel so overwhelmed. And even those glass ones, I argue you can sometimes hand off to someone else to very carefully steward, right? I mean, for any of us with kids, that's what childcare is, right? If we have a daycare or a nanny that we trust, that is saying, here, yeah, I know where this ball is at all times. I've still got it in my brain, but I am actually giving it to someone else for a moment to hold for me.
Yeah. I want to get your thoughts on something. I feel like I've always tried to put things in perspective, and I feel like it's very helpful. Kind of what you're saying now about like what can you let go of, and is it such a big deal? Having a kid also puts things in perspective, and then it becomes like, yeah, like nothing else is really as important as not dropping this particular, literal and figurative glass ball. Sometimes it's it's hard to hear that when you are freaking out about something. It's hard to just be told like, oh, put it in perspective, like it's not so bad. And I'm curious, like from your clinical experience, do people sometimes like give you that pushback? How do you share this concept with somebody in a way that they're ready to accept it and it doesn't feel patronizing or just, oh yeah, easier said than done?
I think it's a little bit of tolerating the both and, right? So, um, with most things in life, they're not black and white. And two things can be true simultaneously. So something can matter and can be a big deal and can be not the biggest deal, if you
Mm,
will.
mm,
Right. And so trying to hold both of those perspectives is true, right? That this feels really important right now because it is really important right now. And it's also okay if it's not done perfectly, right? Like again, maybe sometimes people will say, it doesn't matter what you feed your kid; they'll all be eating like Cheerios off the floor of your van by the time they're like 3. And I see one of my kids is in 5th grade, and the kids had a half day, and there were like masses of 5th graders all walking around the town eating like Cheetos and drinking like Monster energy drinks, and I thought, well, all right. Once they, at some point, they start making their own nutritional choices, and it doesn't really matter whether I got them to try the asparagus or not as a 3-year-old. Uh, so there, yes, it matters. It's not that you're maybe even going over the top and thinking it matters at the moment. And we actually have a lot less control over our kids than maybe we think we do. There's a lot of environmental stuff that contributes to their well-being too. And usually it's not the one little thing we're hyper focused on that's the big deal. It's more actually about the anxiety of being a parent and knowing we probably want to get this thing right more than anything else we've ever wanted to get right in our lives. And that's a hard feeling to just sit with.
Totally. That's really helpful. It's a good way to consider it as well. And the idea that it doesn't have to be one or the other. And something else that's on my mind a lot, and I talk to my guests a lot about, and I would love your thoughts, your clinical thoughts on this. This concept of a kid's psyche is so shapeable, malleable, right? In those first 0 to 6 years, 7 years. And it can feel to me intimidating that you have so much impact on it, right? Like, how are you not going to mess it up in some way? And I would love to hear your thoughts on that as a parent, as a clinician.
Well, I'll be honest. Like when I was first parenting and we just had the one, I used to think everything I did, the reaction was, oh my God, I screwed up and now I've doomed my child to therapy for life.
Right.
Right. So
Totally.
it was
Yeah.
like an occupational hazard. Right. I think the reality is, first of all, your kids show up with about 50% of everything completely out, like decided already. Right. Because that's what the genetic contribution is. And then we think about the environment. And when they're little, you are the environment. Yes. But there's a lot of environment left to shape them. And so, I think it can feel helpful to think about, I mean, scary too. We don't actually have as much control as we like to think, right? We are more, it's the analogy of like, are you a gardener or a carpenter as a parent, right? Carpenters build things, they have a plan, and then they execute things according to plan. Anyone who tries to parent that way is going to get frustrated, overwhelmed, and probably disappointed. And really, we're gardeners, right? We can try to pull some of the weeds, but as a gardener, I have no control over the sun, the rain, the soil, and I don't have control over the seed that my kid is, right? That's that genetic component.
Yeah.
And so I think within that, it's like holding, yes, I have some control and I want to be the best parent I can be, but I'm gonna mess up because I'm a human, and the repair of that kind of mistake is actually the important part. And B, again, I can only do so much, right? There's going to be a lot of other things that create who this person becomes in their life experience.
Yeah. Well, that's helpful. Thank you. I feel better. All right, we're going to move into the final segment called Dr. Ann's Advice Corner. So I'm going to ask you for some advice on a few topics, okay?
All right.
What advice do you have for self care as a busy working parent?
I mean, I don't know how much of it is good advice, but I'd say make time for it and not just remember that self care doesn't always feel good, right? It's not always like going out to a party or whatever. Sometimes it's making that dentist appointment and going to the doctor and keeping yourself healthy for your kid. And I think along those lines, that old saying of like, you can't pour from an empty cup is really true. Your kids are going to do far better with half an hour of your time when it is with a happy, content, fueled parent than with 2 hours of time with a distracted parent who is just kind of running on fumes. So make the time for it because it actually makes you a better parent.
What advice do you have for somebody who is about to be a parent but still has a career that they want to focus on?
I'd say you can do both. Just ask for help with that, right? That you can manage to have it all. It just might not look the way you thought it would. And it's got to be what you want. And I think sometimes that's this piece that people skip is defining what do I actually want? What does it all mean to me rather than to other people? And then if you can kind of hold on to those values and those desires, you're going to be able to find a way to kind of navigate through that dual life.
What's your best piece of advice for a busy working parent?
I think it would be, honestly, have a lot of self-compassion. This is hard because it's hard, not because you're doing it wrong. And if you are even worried about being a good parent, you are a good parent. And then, again, and then on a very basic level, outsource whatever you can, right? Whatever you can afford to outsource that you don't like doing, get someone else to do it, or let it not get done for a little while.
Yeah. What is the best advice you've ever received?
I think it was a hard pill to swallow at the time because I remember being pregnant with my first, but one of my clinical supervisors just kind of said, you have to get used to the fact that you cannot plan everything. As a very type A person, I did not want to hear it. And pretty quickly, even in pregnancy, I had to start getting used to that idea that whatever I plan is not necessarily going to work out. And I've got to kind of go with the flow a little bit more.
What advice would you give to your former self?
I think it would be something very similar, and maybe even to any version of my younger self would be to just chill out a little bit and stop trying to um, make things happen. Trust the process because you're going to end up in a really amazing place without having to force it.
Okay, last question. When this episode comes out, my daughter will be about 10 months old. So, what advice do you have for me as a father of a 10-month-old daughter?
Oh, I feel like that was like a getting to the good part that they have so much fun and personality, and that personality is also going to show up when they learn the word no, and that can really challenging. But as you get into those toddler years, one thing I tried to tell myself was that every quality that is frustrating in a toddler is wonderful in adults, right? You just have to label it differently. So being stubborn is being persistent. A kid that can say no is a kid that can tell you what they want and kind of hold fast to that even under peer pressure, right? So trying to hold again that both and as they get into some of those more challenging behaviors when they get a little older.
Awesome. Well, Anne, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go to learn more about you or connect with you or anything that you'd like to share or promote?
Yeah, they can find my website. It's drannwelsh.com. I've got information there about my coaching practice. I have a group coaching program that is ongoing for working mothers. And they can also find me on LinkedIn at Dr. Ann Welsh. And I'm also on Instagram at dr.welsh.coaching.
All right. Well, I'll be sure to link to all that in the show notes. Dr. Ann Welsh, everybody. Dr. Ann Welsh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.